I got Jesus, and I'm saved, and I'm going to heaven, and there's only 144,000 of us going, even though there's 7 billion people on the planet. And I don't know how you can believe in a God who wants to condemn most of the planet, to a fiery hell. Like, what type of loving, sensitive, omnipresent, omnipotent being wants to condemn most of his beautiful creation to a fiery hell at the end of all this?
What is the purpose of hell? If you could consider what would be the hardest thing you could ever do, the most difficult thing you could ever do. Now you can take a minute to think about it. You can pause this video and think about it for a second. What's the absolute most difficult thing you can imagine to do? So think of this: causing pain to someone you truly love. And you have to go to the extreme. So what's the most difficult thing you can imagine doing? Causing intense or the most amount of pain you can imagine to someone you dearly love. Or it's, again, we're talking in extremes. So the most difficult thing you can imagine doing. Causing the most amount of pain to someone who you love to the greatest extent. So once you imagine that possibility, then think next, what would be the only reason that you would actually do that or do such a thing? And the obvious answer is that only if it was something that was an absolute necessity in order to save your beloved or save that person you loved. And so then we go back to the concept of God, that God loves his creation, so how can he create a hell where they suffer? And the only conclusion we can come to is that, accepting the idea that God loves his creation, how can he submit them to suffering? Only if it's unavoidable in order for them to actually come to that state of being where they can come to him or achieve that spiritual world and be happy. On one hand, if God forced us to come to his world, it would be taking away our free will. There's a spiritual dimension we hear in all our different religious teachings, the heaven, in the Vedas, Vaikuntha planets. And there we'll always be happy, we'll be free of anxiety. Kuntha means suffering, anxiety, and that is the place where we're free of that, we're always blissful. But if God were to immediately transport us there, then it would go against our free will. And it is our free will initially which led us to enter into samsara, material existence, from the Tatashta shoreline region between matter and spirit. So having entered this Tatashta region, or material existence, in order for us to go to that spiritual world, we have to, on the first hand, we have to decide, develop distaste for this world and decide that we really want to go there. And if there wasn't any, it's said that in this world there's no happiness compared to the happiness we can experience in that transcendental world. Therefore, if things were always kind of decent here, not too great, not too bad, then we wouldn't develop so much eagerness to go to that spiritual world. But when we suffer to a great extent, it's like removing cancer cells, like you might have to do chemotherapy. So these anartas, or impediments and kind of sinful desires that cover our true self, in order for them to be cleansed, it requires a difficult operation, surgery. And so that's where we come into this hard theory of evil, is that God allows this to be there just in order to be able to help living entities. So there's actually a story of how the hellish planets, there was the arrangement of Ekadashi. Ekadashi is a special day in the Vaishnava calendar that comes every 11th lunar day. And when one time Krishna, when he was with Arjuna, actually, he was searching for the dead son of a Brahmin. And he went with Arjuna through the different dimensions. And as he was going through the hellish region, or nearby that region, he heard the moans and the cries of all the suffering souls. And then he spoke with the superintendent there, and the person told him, as if Krishna was unaware of this, he told him that all these living entities were suffering because of their karma. And he said, please arrange, he had the desire, God had this desire to relieve their suffering. In that time, Ekadashi Devi appeared. And so when Ekadashi Devi appeared, then she began to help the living entity. So by following Ekadashi, we can be freed of all kinds of sinful reactions. By chanting Harinam, by chanting Krishnam, by following Ekadashi, by following the principles of Bhakti, we never have to fear about hellish suffering. And generally, hell is described to be there for those who are following Vaidhi Bhakti, which means devotion mixed with on reverence and with the fear of reaction. So hell is described there for those class of people who, because they're afraid of having to suffer in a hellish condition of life, therefore they will worship God. And ultimately this also leads to their benefit. It's not really our path. Our path is more the path of spontaneous love, not one of like being a hellfire and brimstone preacher. We preach about the path of divine love. But still, that is there for those people who that may be beneficial for them. It may help them live a moral, ethical life. Simply having that fear that, if we commit sinful activities, we have to suffer in hell. And that also serves a purpose.